of 2 Samuel, we see David becoming king over Judah. And what happens is Saul's kingdom collapses after his death. Saul's only surviving son, Ishbosheth, becomes the de facto king, following in his father's footsteps. But while Ishbosheth is ruling in the north, David is gaining more and more control and influence in the south. Ishbosheth, basically over a period of a few years, finds his own grasp on power rapidly diminishing. And much of that has to do, first of all, with his own father's death. Saul's death at Mount Gilboa threw Israel into a time of great loss and great sorrow. The Philistines moved further into the hill country than they had been in many years. Ishbosheth was actually forced to leave his father's hometown of Gibeah on the western bank, or western shore, I should say, of the Jordan River, and move to the eastern side of the Jordan River to try to hold the kingdom together. And what we are told by the author of 2 Samuel is that as the months progressed, Ishbosheth lost more and more influence, and David's influence rose greatly. Finally, Ishbosheth is murdered, and with that, the kingdom of the north, Israel, is delivered into David's hands, and all Israel then recognizes him as their king. And so at this point, as David becomes king over all Israel, he takes several very important and strategic moves. The first move is to conquer the city of Jerusalem. And this is a very important action by King David, guided by the Lord, by the Holy Spirit. He chooses a new capital for the nation, the northern kingdom. The tribe of Benjamin that had produced Saul, and then the other tribes that were north of Benjamin, that became a separate entity itself. And so when David chooses Jerusalem as his capital city, he's trying to find a place that had not been ruled by any of the tribes prior to this, and could now be the center of a unified nation. And so what happens, as it's described here in 2 Samuel chapter 5, David ends up capturing the city of Jerusalem that had been held by the Jebusites. He does it through an incredible strategy. What the text tells us is that David's men got into the city through in Hebrew it's called the tzinor, often translated a water pipe. It was an impenetrable fortress up until that time, but when Joab and Israel's army managed to basically shinny their way up through the tzinor, through the water column, they were able to get into the heart of the city and capture it. David did what seemed to be impossible. The Jebusites boasted and said, even the blind and the lame will be able to keep David out of the city. And in reality, they snuck in from underground, and it was a remarkable, remarkable victory. By the way, you can still see much of that underground series of tunnels and fissures below the ancient city of David to this day. Fascinating stuff to behold. And if you are not squeamish and not one who is particularly bothered by claustrophobia, it's fascinating to climb around through there. Anyway, David takes the city of Jerusalem, makes it his capital, and immediately then moves the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem. And in this way, he not only has a political capital for the nation, but fulfills what God had promised through Moses some 400 years earlier, namely that he would cause his name to dwell in a place to be named later. And it's so fascinating when you read the Torah, time and again, the Lord says, when you get to the land that I am giving you, when you get to the promised land, there will come a day when I will tell you the place where my name is to dwell. And it's during David's reign, 3,000 years ago, that Jerusalem is designated as that place. And it will become the heart of the Jewish nation, not just in David's day, but to this day as well. And for devout Jewish people throughout the centuries, particularly for devout Jewish people throughout the centuries who had been scattered around the world, the comment that was always made is, next year in Jerusalem. Jerusalem, the capital city, but also the place where God's name would dwell and the place where David's son Solomon would build the temple. And so in those early months of David's reign over all Israel, he consolidates rule. He binds the nation together in a way that they had not seen since the time of Moses. And he establishes Jerusalem as Israel's capital and as the place where the living God will be worshiped and honored and glorified. David, as we said last time, had a heart for worship. David was a man after God's own heart. And at the heart of his administration was not simply rebuilding the country after the disaster of Saul's death. At the heart of his rule was restoring true religion in Israel, to worship God as we have been told to worship him, to go back to what was said to Moses some 400 years earlier. With that, then, David continues to develop his reign, to expand the nation. And what we read in chapters 6, 7, 8, and so forth is David conquering the enemies of the people of Israel. And all of a sudden, what had formerly been an empire in the, lightest sense of the word, that was merely confined to the hill country in the heart of the nation. All of a sudden, David's nation and empire becomes a very large and vibrant one. He expands, pushes the Philistines back, defeats them in some very powerful battles, defeats the Ammonites, the Moabites, defeats what we would today know as the Syrians, extends Israel's power all the way north to the Euphrates River. And under David, during his 30-plus year rule over all Israel, the nation becomes a powerhouse in the Middle East. And it already occupies some of the most important real estate in the world. Now it has an army that is incredibly strong, incredibly skillful, led by a man who was a military genius. David was a brilliant warrior, a brilliant man in many different ways. But David now establishes the nation, and everything that we see is God bringing to David individuals with incredible gifts who have a heart for God, a heart for their country, and Israel experiences a golden age unlike anything they have seen since the days of Moses. But along with that comes great tragedy as well. David is a man after God's own heart. David is a man who has a heart for worship. But David is also a sinful human being, and one event in particular will forever mar his reign. And that is the incident that occurred with Bathsheba. It is described in 2 Samuel chapter 11, the aftermath in chapter 12. The basis of the story is this. David, as best we can tell, and again, it's difficult to get exact chronological pinpoints during David's reign, but in all likelihood, on the best evidence that we have, David was probably in his late 40s, experienced what we in contemporary American society would call a midlife crisis, and had a fling with a young woman whom he saw walking on the top of his palace in Jerusalem. She had been bathing, he was walking around, happened to notice her, invited her over to the palace, and the rest, as they say, is history. By the way, one rather remarkable discovery that has only come to light in the last several years and has only been opened to the public in the last 2 or 3 years is the discovery of what may well be David's palace. Up until just a couple of years ago, you were not allowed to go in there. What you can see is a palace that has been unearthed by a brilliant Israeli archaeologist by the name of Eilat Matzer. Eilat Matzer is the granddaughter of Israel's preeminent archaeologist, the man who really put Israeli archaeology on the map in the late 1940s and early 1950s. But Eilat Matzer, several years ago, uncovered what she and many others believe to be the palace of King David. It's located exactly where the biblical text would suggest it's located. You have to go underground to get to ground level of David's day, but you can actually walk on a metal walkway that allows you to look down into what remains of that palace. And what's so fascinating when you go through there, as you realize if the identification is indeed correct, then you are actually walking through the place where David was when he first saw Bathsheba. You're also walking through the place where David was when he repented and when he wrote the words of Psalm 51, "Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me. Don't cast me away from your presence, and do not take your Holy Spirit from me. Restore to me the joy of your salvation, and uphold me with your free spirit." David goes through a time of incredible testing and a time when there are all sorts of costs to pay because of his actions. David commits adultery with Bathsheba, calls Bathsheba's husband back from battle and suggests that he go home and have a good time with his wife. Take a nice bottle of wine and some cheese and spend the evening together. But her husband Uriah is an honorable man, and he says, I can't go home and sleep with my wife while God's people are out in the field in battle. My honor will not permit me to do that. And he ends up sleeping outside David's palace. David gets him drunk and tries to get him to go home the next night. Uriah won't do it. He still maintains his integrity. And so David writes an order saying, put Uriah in the front of the battle and make sure that he dies. Seals it up, hands it to Uriah and says, give this to General Joab when you get back to the front. And sure enough, what happens is Uriah is killed in battle. And at that point, David thinks, it's all taken care of. Being king has its privileges. But little does he know that God has a way of knowing all things. Nothing we do is hidden from him. And in one of the most dramatic encounters in all of the Bible, after Uriah has died, after Bathsheba has mourned and has been brought to the palace and David marries her, and now we're going to just go on with life as usual, a brave prophet, David's prophet Nathan, confronts the king. And he does it in a masterful fashion, and you can read about it in 2 Samuel chapter 12. He begins by telling a story, and the story is so offensive that David says whoever did such a thing deserves to die and to pay back fourfold what he has taken. And Nathan, with incredible God-given courage, looks at King David and says, "You are the man." And with that, David recognizes, I have sinned against God. He repents. Nathan tells him, well, God has forgiven you, and you will not die, but there will be consequences. And the consequences are devastating for David, for his family, and for the nation. And I know many times people hear this account from 2 Samuel chapter 11 and 12, and their first reaction is, well, God forgave him. Why does all this terrible stuff have to happen? The answer is because sin against God always carries consequences. It doesn't mean that one can't be forgiven. God is abundant in mercy. He is quick to forgive, slow to anger. But there are consequences for our behavior. And for David, the consequences, I said, are widespread and lasting. First of all, it produces all sorts of pain in his own family. And the pain we see as we look at the rest of David's story in the following years. David is now probably late 40s, around 50, and at this point, he sees one disaster after another with his family. After David's adultery and after the murder of Uriah, David finds his own son, the heir apparent, Amnon, behaving in a manner that makes dad's actions look mild by comparison. Amnon ends up raping his half-sister Tamar and then kicks her out of the house. And he's just basically following in his father's footsteps, satisfying his own lust rather than being faithful and obedient. The end result, Tamar's brother, and keep in mind Tamar was the half-sister of Amnon because David had a number of wives, but Tamar's brother, Absalom, it just holds all this anger inside, and 2 years later actually kills Amnon at a drinking party. At that point, Absalom has to flee the country. And after David recovers from all that's gone on and is consoled after Amnon's death, David begins to long for Absalom. His general Joab brings about a scheme to bring Absalom back, and Absalom is brought back, but it doesn't resolve the issue. There is a simmering and bubbling anger that is consuming Absalom. And Absalom will end up turning on his own father, leading a rebellion against David, inciting a civil war within the nation. Absalom is a handsome guy. In fact, all of David's kids who are described in Scripture, they were apparently a good-looking bunch, really good-looking people. But Absalom is a brilliant guy, and he masterminds an incredible scheme to oust the king. He almost succeeds. The only thing that saved David was God. It's just that simple. And here too, in Absalom's rebellion, we see the consequences of David's sin against Bathsheba. Not only does David's own son turn on him, but David's closest advisor, Ahithophel, allies himself with Absalom and the rebels. And throughout the centuries, many people have questioned, well, why did Ahithophel do that? To the best of my knowledge, no one figured it out until the early 20th century, when that fascinating man from Wales that I mentioned in our first class, who had studied the Scriptures and read them through over and over and over again, Brother Joe, saw something that at least we don't have in writing that anyone else caught on to it. But what he discovered was this: Ahithophel was the grandfather of Bathsheba. Ahithophel saw what David did to his granddaughter's husband, killing Uriah and getting by with it. And when the time came for David's own son to rebel against the king, David's close advisor Ahithophel turned on him and basically sought justice for his granddaughter and for her husband. And with that, things went they went into the pit in a hurry. David has to flee Jerusalem. He runs for his life. Were it not for another advisor by the name of Hushai, David probably would have been killed. But Hushai was sent back, and God worked in such a way so that Absalom listened to Hushai rather than to Ahithophel. And the result is that in the end, David triumphed and Absalom lost. Absalom apparently had a larger army. He had the people behind him. David, on the other hand, had a small corps of very, very disciplined soldiers. David's soldiers, the 3 and the 30 and those attached to them, were some of the finest fighting men of their day. We would call them the equivalent of special forces today. These are individuals who accomplished far more than any average run-of-the-mill trooper would be able to accomplish. And they fought boldly and courageously for David, ended up saving his regime. After that, there were still repercussions, and they had to put down another revolt by Sheba, and you can read about all of that in 2 Samuel. It is a sad and a tragic story, and it greatly left a black mark on David and his legacy, all because he had sinned against God by sinning with Bathsheba and by participating in the murder of her husband. David was a good man, but in this instance, David sinned grievously against God, and only by God's mercy was he spared. But it also then sets up what will happen later on. And that is where 2 Samuel comes to a conclusion. We have David speaking his final words. We have a final psalm of praise that David writes. And as we move into 1 Kings, we see David in the last months of his reign trying to consolidate things for the next king. And it's here then that we pick up with the story of David's successor, his son Solomon. Solomon, like David, will reign for approximately 40 years. We don't know how old Solomon was when he became king. The Bible tells us that he ruled for 40 years, but it doesn't give us his age at the time he is seated to the throne. What we do know is he was a young man, in all likelihood, on the basis of the material that we have in the scripture. He was probably in his late teens. May have been somewhere around 18, 19 years old when he became king over Israel. But David ends up dying at the age of 70 in the year 970 BC. His son Solomon comes to the throne in the final months of David's life. And what 1 Kings tells us is that during those final months of David's life, there was still all sorts of scheming going on among David's sons. Adonijah was the oldest of the surviving sons of King David. Although the Lord had made it clear that Solomon was to be David's successor, Adonijah felt that, he had the rights because he was the oldest brother still alive, and he began to gather around him people who supported him, and he got some pretty strong support. His support included the high priest Abiathar. It included the general of Israel's army, Joab, and a whole host of other leading people. And where 1 Kings picks up is David is getting old. He is in the last moments of his life. He's having trouble keeping warm. And so they decide we need to have someone to take care of David, a caretaker for him, and someone who can keep him warm at night. And so a beautiful young Shunammite by the name of Abishag is chosen to care for David as his personal nurse. The Bible goes on to say that David did not have relations with her, but she slept with him to keep him warm and took care of him, and David lived in some degree of comfort in those final months of his life. But while all that is going on, his oldest surviving son, Adonijah, is having a huge party and making plans for the day when Dad kicks the bucket and he gets to be king. And in the midst of this great big party, two people intervene to restore what God had originally said is to happen. And those two people are David's wife Bathsheba and David's prophet Nathan. And together they resolve that they will go to the king and make sure the king realizes what's going on behind his back. They come before David and they say, "Didn't you say that Solomon would be king? Didn't the Lord declare that Solomon would be king?" And David says, "Absolutely." "Well, do you know that Adonijah is already acting as king, and he's gathered a whole host of people around him?" And at that point, David takes decisive action. He's in the final days of his life. But David says it's not going to happen. And with that, he gives orders and says, "Take Solomon, go to the Gihon spring and anoint him as king over all Israel." By the way, you can still see the Gihon spring in the ancient city of David today. And in fact, if you go to the ruins of what may be David's palace, all you have to do is go slightly to the east and then to the south and go down, and you will get to the Gihon spring. The Gihon spring is the only source of fresh water in ancient Jerusalem. It is still bubbling up to this day. If you're not troubled by tight spaces, you can actually walk into the Gihon spring. You can experience it bubbling up at your feet. And if you're really in for some excitement, you can go through the ancient water tunnel that King Hezekiah carved out some 200 plus years after the time of David. It is called Hezekiah's Tunnel. It follows some natural clefts in the rocks underneath the ancient city of David, and was also chiseled out by Hezekiah's engineers. It stretches for about a third of a mile underground. In some spots, it's relatively roomy, enough room so that your shoulders can go from side to side without rubbing the wall, and you can look up with a flashlight and see 20, 30 feet above you. In other spots, though, you get to points where you have to bend over and kind of twist like this to get through, and the whole time there's water from the Gihon spring pulsing at your feet. In the rainy season, it can come up to your hips, and so like I said, if you're not into claustrophobic activities, this is not a place you want to be, but you're actually walking through incredible biblical history as you do it. And so Solomon is taken to the Gihon spring. He is anointed as king over Israel. They blow the shofars. There's all sorts of celebration. Meanwhile, Adonijah is having his party, and they hear this ruckus, and they say, "What's going on?" And the word comes, "Solomon has just been anointed king by your dad." And at that point, damage control sets in. All of those around Adonijah think, "I'm out of here." they leave the party. I mean, the place empties in an instant, and everybody tries to make sure that they are going to be in good with the new king. Adonijah, however, does not give up his desire to be king. And he comes up with a rather interesting plan that you can read about in 1 Kings chapter 2. He actually goes to Solomon's mom, and he says to Bathsheba, "I was this close to being king over all Israel. Could I have a consolation prize?" Now, that is not a literal translation of the Hebrew, but that's what it means, basically. He says, "Can I have a consolation prize? Could you check with the king and just ask him, could I have Abishag, that beautiful Shunammite young lady who was taking care of King David up until he died, could I have her as my bride? It's the least you could do, because after all, I was that close to being king." And so Bathsheba goes to Solomon and says, "I have a request I want to bring to you." Now, over the centuries, people have debated, did Bathsheba fall for that? Or was she being incredibly, incredibly strategic? I lean toward the latter. She doesn't tell her son what to do. She just says, "Here's what's happened. What do you think?" And Solomon is still a very young man, like I said, quite possibly in his late teens. When he hears that his older brother, who did come this close to being king, wants to have David's concubine as his own wife, Solomon knows what's going on. This is a palace coup. And he says, "I may as well give him the kingship right now." Because you see, in the ancient world, if you took the wife of the former king, it meant that you now had his authority. And that's what Adonijah is looking for. He is looking for political influence, and this would be a huge, huge victory. And Solomon says, "Not going to happen." And he gives the order, and Adonijah is killed. And Solomon now begins to establish his kingship in some very dramatic ways in those first few months of his reign. After taking care of Adonijah, he removes two other people from office whom David had held on to, but David knew they were not good. One of them is the high priest, Abiathar. Abiathar had been with David from the time he fled from Solomon. But Abiathar was a descendant of Eli. And if you will recall, Samuel had prophesied to Eli, "Your sons are not going to remain as high priests, and there will come a day when God will raise up a righteous priest, and you folks will no longer be in positions of power." And so Solomon tells Abiathar, you are now into exile. You can remain in Israel, but you are no longer going to be high priest. And in his place, he replaces him with Zadok, a man who had a real heart for God and had been a great supporter of David and now of Solomon. In addition, Solomon gets rid of Israel's general Joab, who was a murderer. I mean, apparently a brilliant strategist, a capable administrator, but a vicious, vicious man. Joab had murdered two of Israel's leading generals, Amasa, Abner, had killed them brutally. David was unable to deal with Joab. Joab was actually a relative. Joab was his cousin. But David said, I can't control this guy. And Solomon does. Solomon says, he's a murderer, he's going to die. Joab runs and grabs the horns of the altar, and Solomon, in effect, says, not going to work. And with that, he sends Benaiah, his right-hand military man, to deal with Joab. And Joab is killed. And at that point, Solomon has established his authority. People know this guy means business. He may be young, but he is consolidating power. But Solomon does more than consolidate power. Solomon has a heart for God. And at this point, Solomon wants to establish what David had begun. David had already begun planning for the temple. David had given to Solomon the plans for the temple, which God had given to him. David had stockpiled massive quantities of gold and silver and bronze, of stone and wood. And Solomon knows his mission is to continue to restore true worship in Israel. And so Solomon goes to Gibeon, where the tabernacle was. Solomon goes there and offers sacrifices. It's very early in his reign. And if you would turn in your Bibles to 1 Kings chapter 3, it's very instructive to read the way Solomon begins his work as Israel's king. This is what we read in 1 Kings 3, beginning at verse 4. It says, the king went to Gibeon to offer sacrifices, for that was the most important high place. And Solomon offered 1,000 burnt offerings on that altar. At Gibeon, the Lord appeared to Solomon during the night in a dream. And God said, ask for whatever you want me to give you. Solomon answered, you have shown great kindness to your servant, my father David, because he was faithful to you and righteous and upright in heart. You have continued this great kindness to him and have given him a son to sit on his throne this very day. Now, Lord my God, you have made your servant king in place of my father David, but I am only a little child and do not know how to carry out my duties. Your servant is here among the people you have chosen, a great people, too numerous to count or number. So give your servant a discerning heart to govern your people and to distinguish between right and wrong. For who is able to govern this great people of yours? The Lord was pleased that Solomon had asked for this. So God said to him, since you have asked for this, and not for long life or wealth for yourself, nor have you asked for the death of your enemies, but for discernment in administering justice, I will do what you have asked. I will give you a wise and discerning heart so that there will never have been anyone like you, nor will there ever be. Moreover, I will give you what you have not asked for, both wealth and honor, so that in your lifetime you will have no equal among kings. And if you walk in obedience to me and keep my decrees and commands as David your father did, I will give you a long life. Then Solomon awoke, and he realized it had been a dream. And God ministers to Solomon in a powerful way in his sleep and speaks to him and gives him a promise that is just remarkable and unique in all of the scriptures. He is going to have wisdom unlike that of anyone else. And God will answer his prayer. Here's this young man realizing there are tremendous responsibilities on me. I've only been in office a matter of months, and I've already had to deal with rebellion from my brother. I've had to deal with some of David's key advisors who were working against me. I've had to stop things in their tracks and establish a new administration. Lord, I need wisdom, and I need wisdom to govern your great people. You have put us here for a purpose. Lord, help me. And God says, you have asked well, and I will give you what you ask, and I'm going to give you even more. And with that, we have an introduction to one of the most gifted individuals who ever lived on the face of the planet. A man who started so well and who could have accomplished so much and did accomplish a great deal, but whose life ended poorly. And that is the tragedy of Solomon. An individual who had such incredible opportunity and who ends up squandering it. And it is incredibly tragic as we see the rest of the story this evening, because ultimately it is all about finishing well, being faithful to the Lord our God, walking in his paths, not veering to the right or to the left from what he tells us to do. It means that we will be out of step with the world, but far better to be in step with God than be in step with what is culturally relevant for the time. Solomon starts on a great path and ends veering off at the end. And so, as we continue his story, we find this man who is blessed with wisdom. One of the classic events in Solomon's reign also comes very early on. It is well known, even among people who have not read the Old Testament lately, but it is the story of two prostitutes who came to the king for justice and judgment. Both of them came before the king. They were both young moms. The one said, "I gave birth to a child. During the night, my roommate, who also had just recently given birth to a child, rolled over on her baby and it died. And so while I was sleeping, she switched babies, put the dead baby next to me and took my baby." And the other prostitute comes before the king and says, "Not so, she's lying. That's not what happened." And so at this point, King Solomon is having to deal with two people who are basically saying, "She did it," and the other saying, "Did not, did too, did not, did too." And Solomon at that point, young guy, keep in mind, I mean, quite possibly still in his teens or maybe 20, something like that. Solomon says, "Bring me a sword." And so the king takes the sword and says, "Now bring that child here. I'm going to cut the baby in half. You can each have half of him." And the woman who is not the mother says, "Yes." But the woman who is the mother says, "Don't do it. Give it to her. I don't want my baby to die." And Solomon says, "She's the mother. Give her the baby." And at that point, all Israel looks at Solomon and says, "Wow, he may be a young guy, but he has wisdom beyond his years." And you can imagine how this emotion-charged instance would have galvanized the country. And they just said, "Did you hear what Solomon, did you hear what he said? Whoa, we have a wise and good king, a man who fears God and who desires for justice to be done in the land. And he's starting so well." And at that point, we're told that God just piles wisdom upon Solomon. In fact, if you look here in 1 Kings chapter 4, some rather fascinating words, starting at verse 29, it says, "God gave Solomon wisdom and very great insight, and a breadth of understanding as measureless as the sand on the seashore." And then it goes on in verse 32, it says, "He spoke 3,000 proverbs, and his songs numbered 1,005. I mean, he is following in his father David's footsteps. 3,000 proverbs. We have only a few of those in the book of Proverbs. 3,000 proverbs, over 1,000 songs that he writes. You know, David wrote half of the Psalms, but Solomon writes 1,005 songs. More than that, it says this. We're told, he spoke about plant life, from the cedar of Lebanon to the hyssop that grows out of the walls. He also spoke about animals and birds, reptiles and fish. From all nations, people came to listen to Solomon's wisdom, sent by all the kings of the world who had heard of his wisdom. God blesses this young man remarkably. And with that, Solomon's kingdom is firmly established. And with that, Israel prospers like never before. And if you think about it, we have gone from the Israelites coming into the land under Joshua to the time of the judges when for 300 years they're eking out a living. to the time of Saul, when they're finally beginning to unify against their enemies, to the time of David, when they become a military power and a nation that has experienced revival and is worshiping the living God, to the time of Solomon now, where all of a sudden riches come pouring into the country. And in Solomon's day, the Bible tells us that silver was considered as nothing because there was so much gold. Israel experiences a prosperity unlike anything it has experienced before and unlike anything it will experience from that time on. And Solomon sees God doing remarkable things, and God uses this brilliant man to lead the country. And the nation is blessed in remarkable ways. But during this time, Solomon also continues what David had first begun, and that is the establishment of genuine worship. Solomon begins by building the temple, and in 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 1, we have one of those incredibly important markers in all of history, in all of the ancient world. It is difficult for us to date many of the events. When we find something that we can hang our hat on and say, here is a clear chronological marker. That's what we have in 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 1. It says that Solomon began building the temple in the 4th year of his reign. And we're able to date that as the year 966 BC. And it says it was exactly 480 years after Moses led the Israelites out of bondage in Egypt. And by that we can go back and date the Exodus. And so 480 years before 966 BC is 1446 BC, the time of the Exodus. And Solomon now begins building the temple, and for the next 7 years, the temple is under construction. It is a massive and incredible structure made out of white marble, massive thing, covered with gold inside and out. I mean, it must have been magnificent to behold. The tons of gold that were used in the construction of Solomon's temple, it's just breathtaking. And as you read the account in 1 Kings, you will be blown away by what you read there, even to the point of using gold nails to hammer in the gold plate that's on the holy place and the Holy of Holies. Israel is experiencing something unlike anything they have seen before. And then after the temple is constructed, Solomon builds his own palace. And right here you begin to see things starting to change. The temple, it took 7 years to build. Solomon's palace, 14. And it made the temple look small by comparison. All of a sudden, this individual who had started so well he's not only made a name for himself, he's looking out for himself. After the temple is completed and Solomon's reign is established, Solomon brings the ark into the temple, and they have a dedication ceremony, and it's one of the most phenomenal worship times that the people of Israel have ever experienced. And at the end of this, as Solomon is establishing true worship and building his palace, and Israel is becoming the nation in the heart of the Middle East, God comes to Solomon a second time. And here you see God's mercy and God's grace to this man. A man so uniquely gifted and so uniquely blessed. And God assures him that I will keep doing, but you need to have a heart that follows me. And so if you turn to 1 Kings chapter 9, verses 1 to 9, we see the second time God comes to Solomon and appears to him. And this is what he tells him. 1 Kings 9, beginning at verse 1, we read the following. When Solomon had finished building the temple of the Lord and the royal palace and achieved all he had desired to do, the Lord appeared to him a second time as he appeared to him at Gibeon. The Lord said to him, I've heard the prayer and plea you have made before me. I have consecrated this temple which you have built by putting my name there forever. My eyes and my heart will always be there. As for you, if you walk before me faithfully with integrity of heart and uprightness as David your father did, and do all I commanded and observe my decrees and laws, I will establish your royal throne over Israel forever, as I promised David your father when I said, you will never fail to have a successor on the throne of Israel. But if you or your descendants turn away from me and do not observe the commands and decrees I've given you, and go off and serve other gods and worship them, then I will cut off Israel from the land I have given them and will reject this temple I have consecrated for my name. Israel will then become a byword and an object of ridicule among all peoples. This temple will become a heap of rubble. All who pass by will be appalled and will scoff and say, why has the Lord done such a thing to this land and to this temple? People will answer, because they have forsaken the Lord their God, who brought their ancestors out of Egypt, and have embraced other gods, worshiping and serving them. That is why the Lord brought this disaster on them. And it's at this point that we see what I can only call an inexorable fall. As Solomon, having been blessed, directed, guided, and warned, sets on a path of self-destruction, personal destruction. It is seen in a number of ways, and we're going to look at a few of them here real quickly. One of the things that happens is the lean, mean kingdom of David becomes a massive bureaucracy under Solomon. And Solomon, while he brings a great deal of wealth to the nation, also sows the seeds of civil war and division. Solomon's economy is founded on four things, according to 1 Kings. First of all, on taxation, and it's easy to overlook this, but what it's basically saying is Solomon divides the country into 12 districts and says each of the districts has to provide everything that is needed for his court 1 month of the year. So 12 districts, 12 months, and they supply all of Solomon's needs. And it's a huge court. I mean, it is massive. Whereas David's court may have numbered, in the hundreds, Solomon's is in the thousands, and huge amounts of wine and food and meat are brought there. The amount of financial support is overwhelming. It's one of the reasons that after Solomon's death, the people of Israel will come to Solomon's son Rehoboam and said, your father laid a heavy yoke on us. Reduce that and we will follow you faithfully. Solomon institutes heavy taxation. He institutes labor conscription. And again, it's real easy to overlook this. In 1 Kings chapter 5, verse 13, it says, he conscripted Israelites to work in bringing all the necessary materials down from what we today call Lebanon to do all the building projects that he had going in Israel. And the way it was done is they would work for 1 month up in Lebanon and then come back and have 2 months back home. The implication that we read in Scripture is they weren't paid for this. They were just conscripted to do it. Now, you can imagine how well that played. Okay, honey, I got to leave for a month, and I'm not going to get paid, and I'm going to be doing this work for the king, but I'll be back in a month, and then we'll have 2 months together before I have to go off again, And it's thousands of people who are conscripted. He also receives a great deal of foreign tribute, and kings and local rulers from all over the Middle East bring huge amounts of wealth to Solomon in tribute. And finally establishes massive trade, including, I might add, a huge fleet of ships. And the Hebrew literally calls them ships of Tarshish. And that word Tarshish actually means to refine metal or to smelt things. These appear to be ore ships. And we're told in 1 Kings 9 and then also in 1 Kings chapter 10 that Solomon had a fleet of ships that actually went out on a 3-year voyage and brought back massive quantities of gold. And people have wondered, where did they go? There have been all sorts of suggestions. The view that has been widely held is that they went to the southern end of the Arabian Peninsula, the area around modern-day Yemen, which is very much in the news, and got the gold there. The only problem with that's not a 3-year journey. Others have suggested they went as far as India. And that does kind of fit with the description of what they brought back as a very real possibility. But there is another possibility, and that is they went further still. In fact, when explorers in the 16th century AD, explorers discovered some islands in the South Pacific, and those islands were named by 16th century explorers, and they were called the Solomon Islands, because they thought perhaps this is where Solomon's fleet went to get the gold and bring it back over a 3-year period. Others have suggested something that at first glance seems absolutely ludicrous, but recent discoveries suggest it's not beyond the realm of the possible. And that is that Solomon's fleet did what we know the ancient Phoenicians, who were Solomon's allies, did, and that is they got all the way to the New World. In fact, up in the Iron Range, and in the UP of Michigan, archaeologists have uncovered the works of ancient miners who came from the Middle East and who mined copper in huge quantities and brought it back. Stuff that long before Columbus and Leif Erikson, they were coming over here. Some have gone so far as to suggest that Solomon may have had his ships sailing to Central and South America, to the Incas and the Aztecs to get gold, and that the accounts that those people told of people of light skin coming from God may actually be Solomon's voyages and Solomon's sailor. Who do know is Solomon became incredibly wealthy. Is Solomon, first of all, demonstrating his authority and will and brilliance to one of the great rulers of his day, the Queen of Sheba, who came to visit. It is an iconic story and account in 1 Kings chapter 10. And she said, "What I heard of you, nowhere near as magnificent as what I've seen here." But along with that, Solomon became enamored of foreign women. And one of the things that Moses had been told by God in the Torah is that when the people of Israel have a king, that king should not take for himself foreign wives, or they will take him away from the living God. And the Lord made it very clear that the kings were not to be like other kings. In fact, in Deuteronomy chapter 17, verse 17, God says that so clearly. If they take a lot of foreign wives, they're going to take their hearts away from me to worship other gods. And that's exactly what happened in Solomon's reign. And so this is where we end tonight. 1 Kings chapter 11, beginning at verse 1. King Solomon, however, loved many foreign women besides Pharaoh's daughter, Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, and Hittites. They were from nations about which the Lord had told the Israelites, "You must not intermarry with them, because they will surely turn your hearts after their gods." Nevertheless, Solomon held fast to them in love. He had 700 wives of royal birth and 300 concubines, and his wives led him astray. As Solomon grew old, his wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not fully devoted to the Lord his God as the heart of David his father had been. He followed Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and Molech, the detestable god of the Ammonites. So Solomon did evil in the eyes of the Lord. He did not follow the Lord completely as David his father had done. And basically what happens is this incredibly gifted, wise man ends up falling prey to greed and sex, and it destroys him. Is Solomon, who had been so richly blessed of God, blew it in the end. And therein lies the warning for us. Finish well. A man's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions, Jesus said. Seek first, which means seek above all else, the kingdom of God. And all these other things will be added to you as well. Solomon started well, ended poorly. And what the Lord is calling his people today to do is to learn from this. The Apostle Paul said to the Corinthians, these things were written down for our instruction, on whom the end of the ages has come. This is not just a history lesson. This is a lesson about walking by faith, and a reminder that even incredibly blessed people can make horrible choices that will have lasting implications, not just for their children and their children's children, but eternally as well. And what the Lord is saying to us is, follow me, trust me, walk by faith, and be obedient. We are not saved by our obedience, but when we're saved, we will be obedient. And that's what the Lord calls us to. And Solomon is a great lesson for us in that matter. That's where we need to end. Our time is up. Let's close with prayer. Lord our God, we are humbled by your brilliance, your goodness, and your mercy. We're also overwhelmed by what we see in your word. Lord, may we apply these things to our hearts. May we have a heart after your heart. May we be like David, an individual who truly was a man after God's own